Coming up next, the Powerpuff Girls. Coming up next, Dexter's Laboratory. Coming up next, Jordan. Coming up next, Susie. Coming up next, Kick Buttowski, Suburban Daredevil. Coming up next, Future Worm. Coming up next, Chuck Chicken. Coming up next, Harry and Bunny. Coming up next, Cat Dog. Coming up next, Cat Scratch. Coming up next, Bobby's World. Coming up next, Love Monster. Coming up next, Dude, That's My Ghost. Coming up next, Matt's Monsters. Coming up next, Pen Zero, Part-Time Hero. Coming up next, Little Einsteins. Coming up next, Victor and Valentino. Coming up next, 12 Forever. Coming up next, Tough Puppy. Coming up next, Samurai Jack. Coming up next, Motor City. Coming up next, Puka. Coming up next, Tiny. Coming up next, Gerald. Coming up next, Avatar, The Last Airbender. Coming up next, The Legend of Korra. Coming up next, Randy Cunningham, 9th Grade Ninja. Coming up next, Kid vs. Cat. Coming up next, My Gym Partner's a Monkey. Coming up next, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Coming up next, Cat Dog. Coming up next, Cat Scratch.